Southeast Asian countries recently agreed to amend the ASEAN Trade in Goods Agreement during the 47th ASEAN Summit in Kuala Lumpur to further deepen regional economic integration, which remains relatively low despite the free trade agreements among the member states. So here are the challenges the association must now resolve to further deepen the economic integration in the regions.
ASEAN member states agreed on updated trade rules under the second protocol to amend the ASEAN Trade in Goods Agreement, or ATIGA upgrade, during the 47th ASEAN Summit in Kuala Lumpur on October 26, 2025. The protocol introduces several key changes designed to meet current trade challenges, including promoting environmentally sustainable trade practices, strengthening the role of micro, small and medium enterprises, improving supply chain connectivity, and providing alternative mechanisms for trade dispute resolution. The updated agreement complements various trade deals among ASEAN countries since the organization's establishment in August 1967. These agreements include the signing of the ASEAN Free Trade Area, or AFTA, in 1992 and the formation of the ASEAN Economic Community in 2015, which paved the way for the establishment of a single market and production base. In his remarks at the 28th ASEAN Plus 3 Summit held as part of the 47th ASEAN Summit, the director of the ASEAN Plus 3 Macroeconomic Research Office, Yasuto Watanabe, said that ASEAN has made commendable progress in trade integration. Tariffs have been cut to almost zero. However, intra-Asian trade has remained unchanged at just over 20% of total trade. This is half of the level within ASEAN Plus 3, ASEAN Plus China, Japan, and South Korea, while intra-ASEAN investment accounts for just above 10% of total FDI, less than half of what fundamentals would predict. In 2024, intra-ASEAN trade reached $823 billion, representing 20% of the region's total trade. Meanwhile, according to the ASEAN Investment Report 2025, intra-ASEAN investment surged 45% year-on-year to $31.64 billion in 2024. AMRO's recent study helps explain why ASEAN economies are at very different stages of development. According to Watanabe, ASEAN needs to move beyond traditional trade measures and adopt a deliberate investment strategy built on two pillars. First, leverage global value chains to accelerate domestic upgrading. ASEAN is already deeply embedded in production networks with Plus 3 economies. The task now is to convert these linkages into channels for inbound tech transfer and skills upgrading to strengthen local firms and create high-quality jobs. Second, support the internalization of ASEAN firms. When ASEAN companies invest across borders, they create regional production and demand networks. Trade agreements alone cannot achieve that. AMRO's simulations show the potentials with domestic upgrading and stronger regional investment. Intra-ASEAN trade could rise to 40% by 2050.
The intra-trade among ASEAN member countries have recently been in the spotlight as it has remained stagnant for years despite trade agreements that have reduced tariffs to nearly zero. So with us today on Economic Outlook, we have Bapak Mohammad Faisal. He is the Executive Director of CORE Indonesia, and we will together discuss the challenges that hinders economic integration in the region. Hello, Pak Faisal. Good morning.
Good morning, Mbak Luisa.
Hi, Pak Faisal. Thank you so much for being here on Economic Outlook and to discuss further about what's currently happening in the ASEAN region. Now, ASEAN member countries have achieved a milestone economic agreements to deepen the regional economic integration and also to strengthen the partnership with their global partners during their summit in Kuala Lumpur last week. In your opinion, Pak Faisal, care to explain to us what was the most important agreement reached during this meeting?
Yeah, among various agreements reached at the meeting, I think the agreement to improve intra-ASEAN supply chain is one of the most important ones because this thing should have been done in 2015 as part of the way to create ASEAN as a single market and single production hub back during the establishment or the inaugurations of ASEAN Economic Community in 2015, 10 years ago. Because in the last 10 years, intra-ASEAN trade has not increased significantly or even tend to decline in share after decades of economic integration and 10 years after the AEC. So that's why it requires further connectivity and investments intra-ASEAN. For your information, intra-ASEAN trade has been declining in the last 10 years from 24% in 2015 to just 20% of total ASEAN trade in last year. So after 10 years of AEC implementation, I think ASEAN has not been very successful in creating the region as one single market and, more importantly, as one single production base. For some commodities like minerals, automobile, ASEAN countries may have been complementary to each other because there's also the trade complementarity index that we usually use to see whether one ASEAN country is complementary to each other. So many of the commodities, like I said, minerals and automobile, they have trade complementarity index, high TCI or trade complementarity index in ASEAN. So ASEAN countries should be able to maximize intra-trade among ASEAN member states for these products. However, high value-added manufactured goods like electronics, some automobiles like EVs, for example, often determined by principal companies, which are located usually mainly in Japan or maybe some in Korea and China. But at least I think ASEAN can deepen intra-ASEAN supply chain for lower value-added products, especially those who are not determined by principal companies, big principal companies, like in automobile or electronics.
That would be the goal. Now, Pak Faisal, during this meeting, the ASEAN members have agreed to amend the ASEAN Trade in Goods agreement during the summit. Do you think that this change, such an amendment, will help further deepen the economic integration within the region? And by how much of an improvement will this benefit the region?
I see that some of the new aspects introduced in the amendments, I think, are quite good because they mention, for example, environmentally sustainable trade, also strengthening SMEs, which is very good. It's as long as it can be implemented properly. And then also improvement of supply chain connectivity. This is the one that I have mentioned before, which is very, very important. However, agreements for these new aspects per se will not solve the problems. That's what I believe. So, because it requires concrete actions on how to achieve what have been agreed. For example, agreements or initiatives to improve the participation of small and medium enterprises actually have been discussed for over a decade in ASEAN. But in reality, there is no concrete actions, and as a result, as we can see in the last 10 years, there's no significant improvements in terms of participation of SMEs in the global market or even in ASEAN markets. Say, for example, Indonesia remains lag behind in terms of domestic SMEs participations in the global market. So ASEAN countries should have concrete strategy to maximize intra-ASEAN trade potentials for complementary products. So this is important to reduce its high dependency on major trading partners outside ASEAN, like the US or China, particularly in the current global trade disruptions and increasing protectionism as well imposed by large export markets like the US.
Well, this is indeed a big concern, having to have made all this agreement, but there's no significant results coming out of it, or as you mentioned just now, concrete actions taken after all the agreements have been made. However, ASEAN have now signed several more trade agreements to boost the intra-trade and intra-investment, but their values have remained stagnant for years. Why is the reason behind this? Why do the intra-trade and intra-investment in the region still remain so low?
There are at least three things that makes ASEAN's current integration has been hampered. First of all, diverse development stages within the ASEAN regions, which is more diverse than the EU, for example. The second factor is limited production network and connectivity intra-ASEAN or between ASEAN countries. And the third one is probably aspects relating to market. Say, for example, market size of ASEAN is still quite modest, or at least not as large as the EU. And but it is not the most important factor. Other factors may also include labor skills, for example, and infrastructure, especially for the less developed ASEAN countries like the CLMV, the Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar. But first, ASEAN economies, the first factor is actually because the diverse development stages. Because at very varied stages of development, from advanced service hubs like Singapore to rapidly industrializing manufacturing bases like Vietnam, for example. And some of them are also lower, on the other hand, lower middle income countries like Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar. So this diversity enables global integration, but reduce internal complementarities. Say, for example, higher income member countries like Singapore, Malaysia, they demand manufactured goods that lower income partners cannot yet supply. For example, components of electronics. So they will depend on outside ASEAN for the supply, especially China, Japan, Korea. And on the other hand, lower income members also lack the purchasing power to absorb higher value regional exports, except for some cases, for example, the Philippines, who imports cheaper automobile products from Indonesia. Just a few cases. But actually, in many cases, trade complementarity index in ASEAN is quite high. And similarly, the export similarity is relatively low. But ASEAN trade has been drawn towards big economies like China because of other factors, like, for example, the competitiveness of Chinese products in terms of the price. So this is the thing that I think ASEAN needs to improve in terms of the cooperations.
Certainly, there's a lot of things that needs to be improved in terms of cooperation, as you have mentioned. Now, Faisal, let's talk about tariffs now, which has been like one of the hot topics throughout the year. The tariffs on the intra-trade have actually been reduced to almost 0% now. Why a low tariff could still not effectively stimulate the cross-border trading in the region? Please explain to us more.
Yeah, because low tariff is not the only factor that can stimulate cross-border trading. Well, actually, the share of ASEAN intra-trade, objectively speaking, remains large because currently it's about 20% of ASEAN's total trade, even though it has been declining from 10 years ago, about 24%. So from 24% to 20% of intra-regional trade as a comparison to global total trade. But on the other hand, ASEAN trade with other large partners increased. Say, for example, with China. The share of ASEAN's trade with China increased from 12% 10 years ago to 16% now. And with the US, especially exports, ASEAN exports with the US also increased from 11% 10 years ago to 16% now. So it means tariff reduction in ASEAN, it's not a single factor that induced trade, because there are also other factors which include supply chain networks, for example, as I mentioned before, and also price competitiveness, because the price competitiveness is actually the very thing that makes ASEAN's trade with China increase. So ASEAN also need to look for a way to improve competitiveness for their products in terms of price as well.
Well, so far, ASEAN has agreed to remove the investment barriers in almost all economic sectors. So how then do we increase our competitiveness? And also, in your opinion, what kinds of incentive should ASEAN provide to boost the intra-investment in the region?
Yeah, I think, ASEAN needs to complement trade liberalization with investment strategy, because investment, or especially foreign direct investments, it can build production networks, transfer of technology, and creates the supplier relationship that sustain deeper trade. So without stronger cross-border investment within ASEAN, it is difficult to enhance complementarity. So one of the things that I think important to do or to increase is actually leveraging existing positions in the global value chain, particularly deepening integration with the plus three economies, ASEAN with China, ASEAN with Japan, and ASEAN with Korea, to build domestic capabilities. Because ASEAN's role as a major production base in several industries like electronics, automotive, and digital services provides channel for technology transfer and also skills. And then it can upgrade liberalization. It's not liberalization alone that can be deepen the integration. So the focus should be on attracting high-skill over FDIs in knowledge-intensive sectors, and then create the internal connectivity within ASEAN to make sure that investments happen, and make sure that one ASEAN countries invest in another ASEAN countries.
Right.
Even though I think this is also not easy, because ASEAN countries in general are not. Almost all of them, maybe only Singapore the exception. Almost all ASEAN countries requires investments from outside. So it doesn't matter from ASEAN or outside ASEAN. So to some extent, they compete with each other in terms of attracting foreign direct investments.
Exactly. There are certainly so many steps needed to be taken in order for all these countries to work together to improve our economy altogether. But thank you so much for the discussion today, Pak Mohammad Faisal, Executive Director of CORE Indonesia. And we'll be happy to have you back again next time on our next discussion. Thank you, Pak.
Sure, Mbak. You're welcome.